Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive?
Always. What are we looking at today?
Well, today's question might seem pretty straightforward at first. Are the Jews really Israelis?
Hmm, interesting. On the surface, it seems like it should have a simple answer, but I bet there's more to it than meets the eye.
Yeah, and the source we're looking at today explores this question from a Christian perspective.
Oh, okay. So we're going to be looking at biblical passages and all that.
Exactly, historical context too. And it gets into some pretty interesting theological interpretations as well.
Sounds fascinating. Where do we even begin with a question like this?
Well, I think a good place to start is with the very foundation, the biblical origins of Israel.
Right, going back to the Old Testament.
Yeah, the source takes us all the way back to the book of Genesis. You know, the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel.
Oh, yeah, and he gets his name changed to Israel.
Exactly. And that's where this whole concept of a chosen people starts to emerge. You know, God establishes this covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, promising their descendants a special land and a unique relationship with him.
So that's where the idea of Israel as a nation and a people comes from.
Exactly. And the source really emphasizes this whole idea of being chosen. They even quote Deuteronomy 7.6, where God says, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession."
Wow, yeah, that's pretty powerful.
Right. It really highlights that special relationship. But here's the thing. The source makes this distinction between simply being a descendant of Jacob and being a true Israelite in terms of faith and keeping the covenant with God.
Oh, I see. So it's not just about lineage. It's about actually living out that chosenness, so to speak.
Exactly. And that distinction is going to become really important as we go further down this rabbit hole.
Gotcha. So where do we go from here? Do we look at how this idea of Israel develops over time?
Absolutely. Next, we're going to shift gears and take a look at how the source tackles Jewish history. They spend a lot of time talking about the exile and return of the Jewish people.
The diaspora, right, when they were scattered all over the world.
Right. They talk about the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem and how the Jewish people were forced to leave their homeland and live in different countries and cultures.
And yet they managed to maintain their identity and their faith through all of that.
That's exactly the point the source is making. They present it as a testament to the resilience of the Jewish people and the enduring nature of God's covenant with them.
Makes sense. It's definitely a powerful story of survival and perseverance.
And then, of course, we can't forget about the big one, the establishment of modern Israel in 1948.
Ah, yeah, a huge turning point in history. And I'm guessing the source has something to say about that.
Oh, definitely. They see it as a potential fulfillment of prophecy, specifically Ezekiel 36.24, where God says, "For I will take you from the nations and gather you from all the countries and bring you into your own land."
Wow, I can see why they would make that connection.
Right. It's a really powerful image of return and restoration. But here's where things get a little more complicated, and the source actually points out something that might surprise you.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is it?
Well, the term Israeli today, it encompasses anyone who's a citizen of the modern state. It doesn't matter what their religious beliefs are or their ancestry.
Well, that's interesting. So you could be an Israeli citizen without being Jewish, and you can be Jewish without being an Israeli citizen.
Exactly. And that's a really important distinction to make because it forces us to think about how these terms are used in different ways.
I'm starting to see where this is going. So if the modern political definition of Israeli isn't necessarily the same as the biblical concept of Israelite, then who does this source actually consider to be the true Israel?
That seems to be the central question they're trying to get at.
And I bet it leads to some pretty interesting answers.
You bet it does. But to get to the heart of it, we need to look at what this source does with the New Testament. They bring in a pretty powerful passage from Romans 9.6 to 8. It says, and I'm quoting here, "For not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel, and not all are children of Abraham because they are his offspring."
Whoa, okay, it sounds like Paul is really challenging the idea that simply being a descendant of Abraham automatically makes you part of Israel in a spiritual sense.
You got it. And the source interprets Paul's words to mean that true belonging in Israel is ultimately determined by faith in God, not just biological lineage.
Wow, that's a pretty big claim.
Right, and it takes us to a really thought-provoking place because the source then goes on to suggest that this definition of true Israel could include Gentile believers who accept Jesus Christ. They're brought into the covenant through faith, essentially becoming part of a spiritual Israel.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. So if true Israel is about faith in Jesus, where does that leave those who identify as Jewish but don't share that belief? It's tricky, right? But the source tries to handle it carefully. They're saying that Jewish people still have a unique place in God's plan, even if, they don't see Jesus as Messiah.
So they're saying, like, okay, true Israel might be about faith in Jesus for them, but God still has this ongoing thing with the Jewish people as a whole.
Yeah, exactly. They even quote Romans 11.29.
What does that one say?
It's where Paul says that God's gifts and calling are irrevocable.
Irrevocable, meaning like no takebacks.
Exactly. Like that covenant is still there. God's not just going to, forget about it.
Interesting. So they're trying to, hold those two things together, their theology, but also acknowledging the Jewish people are still important to God.
Yeah, it's a balancing act for sure.
Yeah.
And they go even further.
How so?
They start talking about this future restoration for Israel. There's going to be a time when, according to how they read the Bible, when Jewish people will recognize Jesus.
Okay. Everyone's going to be on the same page eventually? Is that what they're saying?
Yeah, kind of. They bring up this really powerful image from Zechariah 12.10. It talks about the Jewish people looking on the one they pierced and mourning for him.
Whoa. That's heavy stuff.
Right. And they connect it back to modern Israel existing. Maybe that's a sign that these end times events are getting closer.
Wow. Okay, so that adds a whole other layer to how they see this Jew-Israeli thing. But they don't just talk about theology and prophecy, right?
No, you're right. They also get into some historical stuff.
Because they're trying to figure out who the real descendants of the Israelites are today.
Yeah, they talk about those theories that say modern Jews aren't actually descended from the ancient Israelites. Maybe there were lost tribes or something.
Right. Maybe Jewish identity isn't what we think it is.
And some people use those ideas to try and say that Jewish people don't have a real connection to the land of Israel.
Yikes. So what does our source say about all that?
They basically shut it down.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they say there's just no evidence for those theories. And that kind of thinking can actually be pretty harmful.
That makes sense. But if they're saying true Israel is about faith in Jesus, how do they explain the Jewish people's claim to the land?
Well, they actually point out that even Jesus himself acknowledged the Jewish leaders of his time as descendants of Abraham.
Interesting. So they're using both the Bible and history to make their case.
Yeah, they're trying to find a middle ground.
Yeah.
They can hold their own beliefs, but still recognize the Jewish connection to Israel.
It's complicated for sure, but this source is making me think a lot about how we talk about these things.
Yeah, especially with interfaith dialogue and stuff. If true Israel is about faith, how does that affect how different religions relate to each other?
That's a great point, because these aren't just ideas, right? They affect how people see themselves and how they interact with others.
Exactly. And this source, even though it's coming from a certain perspective, it does encourage us to think about all this carefully and to be respectful of different viewpoints.
For sure. It's a good reminder that these conversations are important, and we got to approach them with sensitivity. Wow, so much to think about, huh? We started way back with Jacob, and now we're here talking about modern-day Israel. It's amazing how one question can lead to so much.
Right. I always find that with these deep dives, we think we're just going to scratch the surface, and then boom, we're down this rabbit hole of history and theology.
Totally. In this source, it's like they're trying to hold on to these kind of opposing ideas at the same time. On the one hand, they're saying true Israel is about faith in Jesus, but then they're also really careful to say, hey, the Jewish people have this real historical connection to the land.
It's nuanced, for sure. They're not saying Jewish identity is wrong or anything. It's more like they're trying to get people to see it from their point of view while still respecting the Jewish perspective,
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It makes me think about how important it is to have these conversations, especially between different religions, when we're dealing with stuff that's so personal, like people's beliefs and identities. How do we do that well? How do we talk about it without stepping on toes?
I think that's what the source is trying to do, in a way. They're modeling a way to have those conversations. Even when you disagree, you got to listen and try to understand where the other person is coming from.
Yeah, I agree. It's not about trying to win or prove someone wrong. It's about learning and growing together.
Exactly. And remembering that these aren't just abstract ideas. They have real consequences in the world, like how we treat each other, how we interpret history, all of that.
So true. This source, even though it comes from a specific viewpoint, it's really challenging me to think about my own assumptions and how I approach these kinds of topics.
That's the power of a good deep dive, right?
Yeah.
It makes you question things, look at things from different angles.
Definitely. This whole thing has been a wild ride, and I hope it's gotten our listeners thinking too.
Yeah, and hopefully it'll inspire them to keep digging deeper. There's always more to learn.
Well said. So, to everyone listening, this has been our deep dive into the question, are the Jews really Israelis? We might not have all the answers, but we've definitely uncovered a lot along the way.
We've looked at the history, the theology, the different ways these terms get used. It's complex, for sure.
But that's what makes it so fascinating. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those conversations going. Until next time.
Yeah.